I'm Phil Porter. My wife and I are managers of Takaraka Bush Resort at Carnarvon Gorge, and we're going up to Boolimba Bluff. Most of the gorge, the geology of the gorge that you can see, the big white cliffs, are a sandstone. It's thought to be in the order of about 180 million years old, which makes it sort of mid-Jurassic period. And it's basically, I suppose, a big fossilised river delta. Covers a very, very large area. There was actually probably from a single river coming in from the west, something very, very big, probably bigger than anything on Earth today. And it's deposited all up about 600 metres in depth of sand. As you can see, we've had a bushfire just go through recently, but this country is designed for fire. It springs back very, very quickly. And Carnarvon Creek that you can see here never ever stops flowing. It has water all year round. The sandstone here is basically like a giant sponge. It just soaks up huge amounts of water and gradually, bit by bit, it seeps out through the bottom. It takes several thousand years to come through. A lot of the vegetation here, you can see the palm trees that are there. They're a macrozania, one of the cycads, a very, very ancient form of plant. In fact, probably some of the oldest on Earth that are still surviving. Probably been around since dinosaur period. And very, very slow growing. They grow at less than a centimetre a year. But these, they appear to be completely burnt, and you'd think they would be dead, but they won't be. They will spring back very quickly. And in fact, the seed from them actually does need fire to germinate. It's a very, very hard seed, and fire splits the seed open and allows it to germinate. The whole area will regenerate very, very quickly. Some of the trees do get burnt beyond repair, and they will die, but not many. The majority will come straight back. Most of the trees in the gorge are a spotted gum. They're the big white trees all down the side of the track. They're by far the most dominant tree in the lower part of the gorge. Once you get up on top of the plateau, up in the Boolimba Bluff area, it's a very different vegetation altogether. It's more iron bark, very tree with a very dark bark. Because of the permanent water, Carnarvon Gorge really is an incredible oasis. The surrounding area is actually relatively dry, not barren, but it is a fairly dry area, but the gorge is just so beautiful and lush. There are actually pockets of genuine rainforest up through Carnarvon Gorge. We're just beginning the climb up to Boolimba Bluff. We're just starting to get up above the gorge here. The big rocks that you can see at the base of the cliffs have just fallen off from the top of the cliff. The cliffs here are very, very vertical, and it's purely because the sandstone is very, very soft. As the area is being uplifted, and there has been a lot of uplift, it actually splits open. The pressure's released from the rock, and the rock splits. And usually it splits along the lines of weakness in the rock. But being a sandstone, there is nothing to stop it. It literally is just compressed sand. And so it splits in a perfect straight line. And their natural weakness is in the rock. And when it does erode back, it will naturally drop off once it reaches one of those cracks. And so you tend to get these very large boulders at the base of the cliffs.
How do we get the right angles? Can you explain that a bit?
Yeah, it is in right angles, and that's simply, again, it's because there's been a big uplift in over the whole area, and so it splits in two directions. And as I said, being nothing to stop that from happening, it splits almost perfectly at right angles. In fact, in some places, it actually does appear as though it's been cut with a saw. Some people actually swear that it has been. They don't tend to think it's natural. You can see on the cliffs when you look up closely at them that they do have these big smooth faces. When erosion happens, down lower it's the creek that's eroding. Up in this area it's probably more wind erosion. It undermines the cliffs. Erosion happens down low, it won't happen up higher, and you end up with an overhang. And being such a soft rock, it's after a while it just can't hang on, it just simply shears off, and so you end up with those very smooth faced cliffs, very, very vertical cliffs. Cliffs like this are very much a feature of softer rock. It is sandstone, it is just simply sand. The sand in this area, it's almost entirely a quartz sand, and that fact and the fact that it's pure white, everything's been leached out of it, means that it has actually come from a huge distance away. We don't know exactly where it has come from. We know it's come from basically west, slightly north of west. At that time, the McDonnell Ranges in the centre of Australia, around Alice Springs, were thought to be somewhere in the order of 4,000 to 5,000 metres high, and it's sort of assumed that that's where most of this has come from. You can really clearly see the big smooth faces and the sort of very vertical straight cracks in the rock.
What you just said then is amazing. This potentially comes from the McDonnell Ranges?
Very likely, yes. You can see here very clearly the way the gorge is formed entirely. It's these perfect vertical cracks, and you can see there's a very smooth face on the inside of those cracks. That's just purely groundwater seeping through the rock, and when it reaches a crack, the water evaporates and it leaves a sort of a hard crust, and they're natural hard points in the rock, and the rock will erode back to that point, but it has a hard time going any further. Here you can really clearly see an area that has eroded out of much softer pocket of rock. Actually, the rock there is mainly clay, which probably means the river that deposited this, there was a little backwater, and the water was able to sit for a while, and the clay settle out into the bottom. There are several little pockets on this climb where you will see that happening. You'll also see a lot of the vegetation literally growing out of rock. Because of the sandstone is quite soft and does hold a lot of water, the trees are able to get their roots right down into it and get hold. And it's still at this point in the climb mainly the spotted gum, but you are starting to get a little bit of other stuff coming in as well. And once we get to the top, ironbark becomes the dominant plant. And even though on Boolimba Bluff you think you're on top of the range, you're actually only about a third of the way up at that point. The range it actually sits on average about 1,100 to 1,200 metres above sea level, but it's about 600 metres above ground level, above creek level rather. And when you get to Boolimba Bluff, you're actually at 230 metres. So you're not much more than a third of the way up. In this area, you can see now that it really is ironbark that has become the dominant species. And you may notice that the ground is different, the soil is quite different colour. It's a little bit more red colour. On top of the sandstone, there's a layer of basalt, which is a cooled lava. About 38 million years ago, there was a lot of volcanic activity, and it's poured a layer of lava over top of the sandstone. And as that erodes, it washes down and collects on the Boolimba Bluff, on top of the Boolimba Bluff, where it's a little bit flatter area, and it contains a lot of iron, and hence you get that reddy coloured soil. And it's because there is a very, very different soil, a lot more iron in the soil than down lower, you get the different trees growing. But the ironbark tree, even though it is very burnt out through this area, they tend to survive very, very well in a fire.
seemed like the fire had stopped at the track.
Yeah, it looks like it had. It stopped right there. Yeah, it's now you're starting to look back down over top of the gorge from above. It's the beauty of Boolimba Bluff. It's the only place that you are able to get up above easily and look down on it. You'll also see how the soil here is becoming much more a red clay soil, just from that weathered basalt that's being washed down and gathering on this little flat area on the end of Boolimba Bluff. But if you look across from Boolimba Bluff, you'll see the initial cliffs, the 230 metre high cliffs, but then it goes up another almost 400 metres above that to the top of the range. You'll also see how smooth the top of the range is. It's a very flat, level area. The uplift in this area, basically the whole area has simply just uplifted as a whole, rather than being buckled and bent up at sharp angles. In fact, it's actually lying at almost exactly the same angle that it was originally deposited there in. There's been very, very little movement as far as that goes. Some of the trees have got barely any soil that they're growing in. We're just approaching the lookout at Boolimba Bluff. There's quite interesting marks. You can see them very, very clearly in the rocks. They call them puddle marks. It's basically when this area was laid down, it was I suppose like a huge estuary area, and there were very shallow rivers and creeks, and sort of as a tide washes in and out, you sort of tend to get little ripples forming, and that's exactly what you're seeing here. It's preserved beautifully, actually, on the top of Boolimba Bluff. There are other areas that you can see it as well. You can also see how smooth, how sheer those cliffs are, and the very smooth faces on them. But all up, it is a very, very interesting geology. You can really picture what was happening in the area 180 million years ago. It certainly would have looked very, very different to what we're looking at now. In fact, where we're looking at the moment, we would have been looking out onto a big shallow sea.
So was the river flowing into a sea?
Yes, yeah, a shallow sea. It's probably something similar to what's happening in the Sea of Japan, between Japan and China. There would have been land beyond it, but it was a big sort of shallow basin area.
So you have these McDonald Ranges, the height of the Rockies, and that material is flowing off them.
Being washed down and deposited down to here. Yeah. And it's fairly, I mean, there's no way of knowing. There's absolutely no way of knowing. But it is known that the McDonald Ranges were that height. You can see that in the layers in the rock there. And this rock is purely silica sand. And silica sand is one of the last things that will dissolve in fresh water. So as it's getting washed down a big river, everything gets washed out and gets leached out and washed away. But the silica remains because it's almost insoluble in cold water. And for this to be purely silica and purely white, there's no impurities at all, it really means it has come from a long, long distance away. So it's I think it can be pretty safely assumed, I suppose, that it has come from that area. And it covers a huge area all up. There's actually hundreds of square kilometres of the deposits. But the initial deposit you're looking at here it's called the precipice sandstone because it does form these very precipice cliffs, very sharp, very angular cliffs. The entire gorge is actually quite angular. When you see it from above, instead of being rounded like most rivers are when they're a little bit older, this is actually very sharp angles. And it's because it is following those natural fractures in the rock. They were just natural weak points, and it was able to get into them and gouge it out. So the gorge, bit by bit, is gradually widening up. It won't get a lot deeper than what it is at the moment, but it will widen up. It's actually eroded down to a level now of mudstone down at the creek level, and the mudstone is basically almost impervious to water, and that's why Carnarvon Creek has never ever stopped flowing. The water seeps down through the rock, it hits the mudstone layer, can't go any further, and it's forced out. And so we're now looking right down along Carnarvon Creek. The expedition range out behind the gorge, 70 kilometres, 70 or 80 kilometres out, is actually part of the same system. It's geologically almost the same. But you can also see in the cliffs in this area, the lower cliffs are made of sandstone. The sandstone goes right up for another several hundred metres, but the very final layer right on the top is that layer of basalt that was spread over by volcanoes some 37, 38 million years ago. You can also see some pine trees growing there. They're the native calitris pine, which don't tend to grow down in the valley as much. They tend to only be up on the top as well. You can see a sharp spire of rock in the background, and a lot of people actually do assume that to be volcanic, but it's not. It's made purely of the sandstone. It's just a little area that was, I suppose, had fractures around it, and it's the surrounding areas eroded away and left that standing. Geologically, a very, very temporary feature. You're looking back down through the gorge that Carnarvon Creek is cutting through the layers below. Clearly see the basalt layer on the top of the cliffs. It's a darker layer, almost perfectly horizontal. You can see a thin band of dark rock. That's now the gorge where Carnarvon Creek is cutting down. The staining, the colour on the cliffs is purely staining. The cliffs themselves are actually, the rock is very, very white. The staining is just from lichen and moss and so on, and a bit of dirt getting washed over the side. But when the rock is freshly fractured, it's actually pure white. And in many places up in the gorge, you'll see these big white patches, and that means it has recently broken away.
How about the fire?
Yeah, the fire that's come through here. It covered a huge area. It was quite a huge fire, but this area does recover very, very quickly. It's it won't affect the area that much really in the long run. Majority of the animals are able to get away and escape from it, and the majority of the plants will spring straight back. In fact, the Aborigines have been burning this area for tens of thousands of years. And so, in a way, fire is not probably a bad thing for this area. Only for the infrastructure of the area, obviously. But luckily, this fire, most of us escaped reasonably well. Looking out over the expedition range, 80 odd kilometres out to the west of us. You can also see the enormity of the gorge too. It's a lot bigger than what you tend to think it is. When you're down in the gorge, you're first seeing the 230 metre high cliffs at the entrance, and most people are very, very impressed with the depth of the gorge, but in actual fact it is 600 metres deep from top to bottom. You're looking down on the rangers station, you can clearly see the areas where it has been burnt compared to the areas that haven't been burnt. They were very, very lucky that they didn't lose much infrastructure down at the ranger station. So that's been Boolimba Bluff. Carnarvon Gorge is a very, very beautiful area, very unique area, and Yeah, the beauty of Boolimba Bluff is that you can get up above and look down over it from on top of it. So a very unique view, and especially for somebody who's interested in geology, you've got 230 metres of the sediments just beautifully exposed, and you can see exactly how it was all formed and imagine what was happening here back 180 million years ago.